greetings everybody, Gleekon here again with another episode of Lore of Warcraft. So we just did a few Let's Plays. We've been doing a lot of those lately, but we've now reached a point where we kind of need to progress. There's a lot of story to be told in something that is just sort of pressed forward in the game, but they really establish a lot of lore. But first, before we get to all of that, stay a while and listen to Chapter 2 of Arthas, the Rise of the Lich King. So on this book, we last left off with, we had a little prelude where it was like some spirits, some Tonka and stuff, sensing a rising, probably the rising of the Lich King. And then we did the first chapter where he was a lad and he saw as the humans came back, the refugees from Lordaeron, or from Stormwind rather, after they lost the first war, they went back at the start of the second war and they convinced Taranis, who is Arthas' father, to kind of be a figurehead and really unite everyone and create the alliance. And now things have passed a little bit, and the second war is over, and the battling between the orcs has picked up. And as a matter of fact, the dark portal's been reopened, and forces are now going on to Draenor. And now we're going to see kind of the intimate youth, a little bit older now, a couple years older, of Arthas, but also just how he's got his own central things in life. But there's still, the war for him as a child is distant. It's still a backdrop, even when another world is being traveled to. Here we go, Chapter 2. Also, sorry for the layout. This book I couldn't find it in the other format, so I had to use this different reader, and it just likes to lay these pages out. It's harder for me to read. It probably won't be that big of a deal for you guys. Arthas was frustrated. He thought when word had come about the orcs that he'd finally begin serious training, perhaps alongside his new best friend Varian. Instead, exactly the opposite happened. The war against the Horde resulted in everyone who could swing a sword joining the armed forces, right down to the master blacksmith. Varian took pity on his younger counterpart and did what he could for a while, until at last he sighed and looked sympathetically at Arthas. Arthas, I don't want to sound mean, but I'm terrible, Varian grimaced. The two were in the armory hall, sparring with helms, leather chest pieces, and wooden training swords. Varian went to the rack and hung up the training sword, removing his helm as he spoke. I'm just surprised, because you're athletic and fast. Arthas sulked. He knew Varian well enough to know that the older prince was trying to soften the blow. He followed sullenly, hanging up his own sword and unfastening his protective gear. In Stormwind, we start training when we're quite young. By the time I was your age, I had my own set of armor specifically designed for me. Don't rub it in, Arthas grumbled. Sorry, Varian grinned at him, and Arthas reluctantly gave a small smile back. Although their first meeting had been laced with grief and awkwardness, Arthas had discovered that Varian had a strong spirit and a generally optimistic outlook. I just wonder why your father didn't do the same for you, Arthas knew. He's trying to protect me. Varian sobered as he hung up his leather chest piece. My father tried to protect me, too. Didn't work. The realities of life have a way of intruding. He looked at Arthas. I'm trained to fight. I'm not trained to teach fighting. I might hurt you. Arthas flushed. No suggestion that Arthas might hurt him. Varian seemed to see that he was only digging himself deeper into a hole with the younger boy and clapped him on the shoulder. Tell you what, when the war is over and a proper trainer can be spared again, I'll come with you to talk to King Taranis. I'm sure you'll be handing me my rear in no time. I mean, maybe. I don't remember who kills Varian, but Arthas certainly becomes a bad mamma jamma. The war eventually did end, and the alliance was triumphant. The leader of the Horde, the once mighty Orgrim Doomhammer, had been brought back to Capital City in chains. It had made a big impression on both Arthas and Varian to see the powerful orc paraded through Lordaeron. Turalian, the young paladin lieutenant who had defeated Doomhammer after the orc had slain the noble Anduin Lothar, had shown mercy in choosing to spare the beast. Taranis, who was at heart a kindly man, continued in that fashion by forbidding attacks on the creature. Jeers, boos, yes, seeing the orc who had terrorized them for so long now powerless, an object of scorn and derision, heartened morale. But Orgrim Doomhammer would not be harmed while in his care. It was the only time Arthas had seen Varian's face ugly with hate, and he supposed he could not blame the other boy. If orcs had murdered Taranis and Uther, he supposed he'd want to spit on the ugly green things too. He should be killed, Varian growled, his eyes angry as they watched from the parapets as Doomhammer was marched toward the palace. And I wish to be the one, I could be the one to do it. He's going to the Undercity, said Arthas. The ancient royal crypts, dungeons, sewers, and twining alleys deep below the palace had somehow gotten that nickname, as if the palace was simply another destination. That's our first mention of the Undercity. Dark, dank, filthy. The Undercity was intended only for prisoners or the dead, but the poorest of the poor in the land somehow always seemed to find their way in. If one was homeless, it was better than freezing in the elements, and if one needed something, not entirely legal, even Arthas understood that that was where you went to get it. Now and then the guards would go down and make a sweep at the place in a desperate and ultimately futile attempt to clean it out. No one ever gets out from the Undercity, Arthas reassured his friend. He'll die in captivity. Too good for him, Varian said. Turalyon should have killed him when he had the chance. Varian's words were prophetic. The great orcish leader had only appeared to be humbled by the scorn and hatred leaped upon him. Turned out he was far from broken. Lured by his dispiritedness, or so Arthas gleaned by eavesdropping, the guards had grown lax in their care of him. No one was quite sure how Orgrim Doomhammer's escape had been engineered, because no one survived to report on it. Every guard he encountered had gotten his neck broken, but there was a trail of bodies, that of guards, indigents, and criminals. Doomhammer did not discriminate, leading from the wide-open cell through the Undercity to the single escape route, the foul-smelling sewers. Doomhammer was captured again shortly thereafter, and this time placed in the internment camps. When he escaped from there, too, the Alliance collectively held its breath, waiting for a renewed attack. None came. Either Doomhammer was finally dead, or they had shattered his fighting spirit after all. So that is interesting. We haven't had that mentioned in any other area, so that's probably, we're now getting actually a little bit ahead. We haven't talked about Doomhammer escaping, and I mean, at some point he would have to get out, so I wonder if that's actually like something that's a prelude or told in the guide or something, the manual to Warcraft 3, because I'm assuming that, I don't know, maybe that might be part of it. So that's interesting. Little foreshadowing, little peek ahead. 2 years had come and gone, and now it looked like the dark portal through which the Horde had entered Azeroth the first time, the portal that the Alliance had shut down at the end of the Second War, was going to be reopened. Or had already been reopened. Arthas wasn't sure which, because nobody apparently seemed to want to bother to tell him anything, even though he was going to become king one day. Yeah, so that's about all we're going to get with that. It's kind of vague, like we're somewhere around where we went through, maybe. It was a beautiful day, sunny and clear and warm. Part of him wanted to be outside with his new horse, whom he had named Invincible, the same foal he had been seen being born on that bitter winter day 2 years ago. Maybe he'd do that later, but for now, his footsteps took him to the armory where he and Varian had sparred and Varian had embarrassed him. The slight was unintended, to be sure, but it stung all the same. 2 years. So that's our first reference to Invincible. Like one of the most coveted mounts in the game. I'm sure that any of you guys that play know it. I do not have Invincible. It can't be that. There's a lot of people out there, some OGs that have Invincible or that get it. I see probably about once a month I have an Invincible sighting. But the drop rate is supposedly just preposterously low. Arthas walked over, and Invincible is the Lich King's mount. Arthas walked over to the rack of wooden training swords and took one down. At 11, he had what his governess called a growth spurt. At least she'd called it that the last time he had seen her, when she wept and hugged him and declared him a proper young man now, and no longer in need of a governess. The little sword he had trained with at 9 was a child's sword. He was, indeed, a proper young man, standing at 5'8", and likely to grow even taller if his heritage was any indication. He hefted the sword, swinging it this way and that, and suddenly grinned. At 11? Oh, so I wonder if he's a little bit past 11? But still, at most, what? He's 11, 12, maybe 13. 5'8" at 13, okay, I could see that. 5'8" at 11 would be crazy. He advanced on one of the old suits of armor, gripping the sword firmly. "Hoy!" he called, wishing it was one of the disgusting green monsters that had been such a thorn in his father's side for so long. He drew himself up to his full height and lifted the tip of the sword to the suit of the armor's throat. "Think you to pass here, vile orc? You are in Alliance lands. I will show you mercy this once. Be gone and never return." But the orcs didn't understand surrender or honor. They were just brutes. So it would refuse to kneel and show him respect. "What? You will not depart? I have given you a chance, but now we fight!" And he lunged as he had seen Varian do, not directly at the armor. No, the thing was very old and very valuable, but right beside it. Strike, block, duck in under the swing, bring the sword all the way across the body, then whirl, and he gasped as the sword seemed to take on a life of its own and flew across the room. It landed loudly on the marble floor, sliding along with a grating sound before slowly spinning to a stop. Damn it! He looked toward the door, and right into the face of Muradin Bronzebeard. Muradin was the dwarven ambassador to Lordaeron, brother to King Magni Bronzebeard, and a great favorite at court for his jovial, no-nonsense approach to everything from fine ale and pastries to matters of state. He had a reputation as an excellent warrior as well, cunning and fierce in battle. So Muradin is talked about in the Beyond the Dark Portal book, so he's present there. Also, that book is co-wrote by Christy Golden, so she's tying her own other writings in, although I have a feeling this book was written later, significantly, or at least a couple years later. But also Muradin is a big part. Anybody that has played Wrath of the Lich King, if you've gotten deep into it at all, Muradin is known to be the main companion of Arthas, all the way up into his full insanity, or full turning over to the dark side. And he had just watched the future king of Lordaeron pretend to fight orcs and throw his sword clear across the room. Arthas felt his whole body break out in a sweat. He knew his cheeks were pink. He tried to recover. Ambassador, I was just..." The dwarf coughed and looked away. "I'm looking for your father, boy. Can you direct me? This infernal place has too many turns." Arthas mutely pointed to a stairway on his left. He watched the dwarf go. No other words were exchanged. Arthas had never been more embarrassed in his life. Tears of shame burned in his eyes, and he blinked them back hard. Without even bothering to put away the wooden sword, he fled the room. 10 minutes later, he was free, riding out of the stables and heading east into the hills of Tristful Glades. He had 2 horses with him, a gentle, elderly, dapple-gray gelding called Trueheart, upon which he was mounted, and on a training lead, the 2-year-old colt, Invincible. So Tristful Glades, I know we've referred to Tristful numerous times. This might be the first time we've officially labeled the surrounding regions of Lordaeron and the Undercity as Tristful Glades. He'd felt the bond between them from the moment they had locked eyes, moments after the foal's birth. Arthas had known then that this would be his steed, his friend, the great horse with a great heart who would be as much a part of him as, no, more than, his armor or weapons. Horses from good stock such as this one could live 20 years or more if cared for well. This was the mount who would bear Arthas elegantly in ceremony and faithfully on daily rides. He was not a war horse. Such were a breed apart, used only for specific purposes at specific times. He'd have one when he went into battle, but Invincible would, and indeed already had, become a part of his life. The stallion's coat, mane, and tail, gray at his birth, had turned white as the snow that had coated the ground on that day. It was a color that was rare even among the Balnir-bred horses, whose white coats were really mostly just light gray. Arthas had toyed with names like Snowfall or Starlight, but in the end he followed the informal tradition of Lordaeron knights and gave his steed the name of Equality. Uther's mount was steadfast, Taranis' courageous. His was Invincible. And I mentioned this a while back on the Chapter 1, but the Balnir Farmstead is just one of the small little quest hubs in Tristful Glades, so I really like how the author is bringing in all this wow, tying it in, like retconning almost in a way. Because I'm guessing she wrote this either just immediately after, during, or right before this expansion, The Wrath of the Lich King. Which is good for us considering Wrath of the Lich King Classic has just announced and will be coming out in about a month or so. So it's kind of a perfect time for this. Arthas wanted desperately to ride Invincible, but the horse master warned him that 2 years old was at least a year too young. "Tool's a baby," he said. "They're still growing. The bones are still forming. Be patient, your highness. Another year isn't that long to wait for a horse that'll serve you well for 2 decades. But it was a long time to wait. Too long. Arthas glanced back over his shoulder at the horse, growing impatient with the plodding canter that seemed the most that true heart could summon. In contrast with the elderly gelding, the 2-year-old moved almost as if floating, with hardly any effort. His ears were pricked forward and his nostrils flared as he scented the smells of the glade. His eyes were bright and he seemed to be saying, "Come on, Arthas, it's what I was born for." Surely one ride couldn't hurt. Just a little canter, then back to the stables as if nothing had happened. He slowed True Heart to a walk and tied the reins to a low-slung tree branch. Invincible whickered as Arthas walked up to him. The prince grinned at the velvety softness of the muzzle, brushing his palm as he fed the horse a piece of apple. Invincible was used to having a saddle. It was part of the slow and patient breaking process to get the horse accustomed to having something on its back. But an empty saddle was much different from a live human being. Still, he'd spent a lot of time with the animal. Arthas said a short prayer, and then quickly, before Invincible could sidestep out of the way, vaulted onto the horse's back. Invincible reared, neighing furiously. Arthas wrapped his hands in the wiry mane and clung like a burr with every inch of his long legs. The horse hopped and bucked, but Arthas held on. He yelped as Invincible tried to scrape him off by running beneath one of the branches, but did not let go. And then Invincible was galloping. Or rather, he was flying, or at least so it seemed to the giddy young prince, who crouched low on the horse's neck and grinned widely. He'd never been on an animal this fast before, and his heart pounded with excitement. He didn't even try to control Invincible. It was all he could do to simply hang on. It was glorious, wild, beautiful, everything he dreamed of. Before he even realized what was happening, Arthas was hurtling through the air to land hard on the grassy earth. For a long moment he couldn't breathe from the impact. Slowly he got to his feet. His body ached, but nothing was broken. But Invincible was a rapidly disappearing dot in the distance. Arthas swore violently, kicking a hillock and balling his fists. He was in for it now. Sir Uther the Lightbringer was waiting for him upon his return. Arthas grimaced as he slid off True Heart and handed the reins to a groomsman. Invincible came in. Oh, this is Uther. Invincible came back a short time ago by himself. He had a nasty cut on his leg, but I'm sure you'll be glad to know the horsemaster says he'll be fine. Arthas debated lying, telling Uther that he'd been spooked and Invincible had fled, but it was obvious from the grass stains on his clothes that he'd fallen, and Uther would never believe that the prince couldn't stay on gentle old True Heart, spooked or not. You know you are not supposed to ride him yet, Uther continued inexorably. Arthas sighed. I know. Arthas, do you not understand? If you put too much pressure on him at this age, I get it, all right. I could cripple him. It's just the one time. And that's all it will be, isn't it? Yes, sir, Arthas said sullenly. You missed your lessons. Again. Arthas was silent and did not look up at Uther. He was angry, embarrassed, and hurting, and wanted nothing more than a hot bath and some briar-thorn tea to ease the pain. His right knee was starting to swell. At least you are in time for the prayer session this afternoon. Uther eyed him up and down. Though you'll need to wash up. Arthas was indeed sweaty and knew he smelled like horse. It was a good smell, though, he thought. An honest one. Hurry up. We'll be assembling in the chapel. Arthas wasn't even sure what the prayer session was focusing on today. He felt vaguely bad about that. The light was important to both his father and Uther, and he knew that they badly wanted him to be as devout as they were. But while he couldn't argue with the evidence of his own eyes, the light was most definitely real. He'd seen priests in the New Order of the Paladins work true miracles with healing and protection. He'd never felt called to it. Sit and meditate for hours as Uther did, or make frequent references in reverent tones as did his father. It was just there. An hour later, scrubbed and changed into an outfit that was simple yet elegant, Arthas hurried to the small family chapel in the royal wing. Which is interesting because technically Arthas does become a paladin, but you also know he's going to almost be like an anti-paladin. He's going to abandon the darkness for sure, and with very little internal struggle, at least from the game side. It was not a large room, but it was beautiful. It was a miniature version of the traditional chapel style that could be seen in every human town, perhaps a trifle more lavish with regard to the details. The chalice that was shared was finely wrought of gold and inlaid with gems. The table upon which it lay an antique. Even the benches had comfortable padding, while the common folk had to make do with flat wooden ones. He realized as he entered quietly that he was the last, and winced as he recalled that several important personages were visiting his father. In addition to the regular attendees, his family, Uther and Muradin, King Trollbane was present, though he looked even less happy than Arthas to be here. And someone else. A girl. Slender and straight, with long blonde hair, her back turned to him. Arthas peered at her, curious, and bumped into one of the benches. He might as well have dropped a plate. Queen Anne, still a beauty in her early 50s, turned at the sound, smiling affectionately at her son. Her gown was perfectly arranged, her hair pulled back in a golden coif from which no unruly tendril escaped. Callia, 14, looking as gawky and coltish as Invincible had been at his birth, shot him a scowl. Evidently word of his misdeeds has gotten out, or else she was just angry with him for being late. Taranis nodded at him, then returned his gaze to the bishop giving the service. Arthas cringed inwardly at the quiet disapproval in that gaze. Trollbane paid him no mind, and Muradin, too, did not return. So there's a story here as well, because we know the Forsaken is going to happen in Warcraft 3. And I don't know what happens to Taranis, but Callia does become Forsaken, and possibly Queen Leanne as well. And now in the current lore, Callia is basically one of the council that leads, and really kind of the head one that leads the Forsaken. So that's interesting in Sylvanas' absence that she now runs that faction. Arthas slouched down onto one of the benches against the back wall. The bishop began to speak and lifted his hands, limned with a soft white radiance. Arthas wished the girl would turn a little so he could catch a glimpse of her face. Who was she? Obviously the daughter of a noble or someone else of high rank, else she would not be invited to attend private family services. He thought about who she might be, more interested in discovering her identity than in the words of the service. "And His Royal Highness Arthas Menethil," intoned the bishop. Arthas jerked to attention, wondering if he'd missed something important. "May the light's blessing be upon him in every thought, word, and deed, so that he may thrive beneath it and grow to serve it as its paladin." Arthas felt a sudden calming warmth flow through him as the blessing was laid upon him. The stiffness and soreness vanished, leaving him refreshed and at peace. The bishop turned to the queen and the princess. "May the light shine on her royal majesty, Leanne Menethil, that she—" Arthas grinned and waited for the bishop to complete the individual blessings. He'd named the girl then. Arthas leaned against the back rim of the wall. "And we humbly request the light's blessing on Lady Jaina Proudmoore. May she be blessed with its healing and wisdom, that she—" So now we have our first introduction to Jaina Proudmoore. A big member of Kul Tiras. I feel like she's got to be involved before that expansion, possibly as early as Warcraft 3, but she's one of the major heroes of the Alliance, for sure. She's a big part of BFA. She's just a huge thing, and I think it's cool that Leanne Menethil Harbor's obviously named after her, which is also that the city of Menethil that's brought up in the other book. Aha! The mystery girl was a mystery no longer. Jaina Proudmoore, a year younger than he, daughter to Admiral Dalen Proudmoore, naval war hero and ruler of Kul Tiras. What did intrigue him was why she was here, and that her studies at Dalaran go well. We ask that she become a representative of the light, and that in the role of a mage she will serve her people well and truly. And that's cool that we're already knowing she's going to be a mage. That made sense. She was on her way to Dalaran, the beautiful city of Magi, not too far from Capital City. Knowing the rigid rules of etiquette and hospitality that were so pervasive in royal and noble circles, she'd be here for a few days before traveling on. This, he thought, could be fun. At the end of the service, Arthas, already located near the door, stepped out first. Muradin and Trollbane were the first out, both looking slightly relieved that the service was over. Taranis, Uther, Leanne, Callia, and Jaina followed. Both his sister and the Proudmoore girl were fair-haired and slender, but the resemblance stopped there. Callia was delicately boned, with a face right out of old paintings, pale-skinned and soft. Jaina, however, had bright eyes and a lively smile, and she moved like someone who was well accustomed to riding and hiking. She obviously spent a great deal of time out of doors, as her face was tanned, with a smattering of sprinkles across her nose. This, Arthas decided, was a girl who would not mind getting a snowball in the face, or going for a swim on a hot day. Someone unlike his sister he could play with. "Arthas, a word with you," came a gruff voice. Arthas turned to see the ambassador peering up at him. "Of course, sir," Arthas said, his heart sinking. All he wanted to do was to talk to this new friend. He was already sure they would get along famously, and Muradin probably wanted to scold him again for the embarrassing display earlier in the armory. At least the dwarf was discreet enough to walk a few paces away. He turned to face the prince, stubby thumbs hooked into his belt. Gruff face nodded in thought. "Lad," he said, "I'll get right to the point. Your fighting form is terrible." Again, Arthas felt the blood rush to his face. "I know," he said, "but father—" "Your father has many things on his mind. Did he be saying a thing against him?" "Well, what was he supposed to say?" "I can't very well teach myself fighting. You saw what happened when I tried." "I can that. I'll teach you if you like." That's kind of cool. So in a way, Muradin's got to have some guilt too, because he's a trainer. He taught Arthas. He brought him on this path. You will?" Arthas was at first disbelieving, then delighted. The dwarves were renowned for their fighting prowess, among many things. Part of Arthas wondered if Muradin would also teach him how to hold his ale, another thing dwarves were known for, but he decided not to ask that. "Aye, that's what I said, wasn't it? I spoken with your father, and he's all for it. Been put off long enough as it is. But let's get one thing straight. I'll take no excuses, and I'll be pushing you right hard. And if at any moment I say to myself, 'Muradin, you're wasting your time,' I stop. You agree, boy?" Arthas fought back an incongruous giggle at the thought of someone who stood so much shorter than he calling him boy, but bit it back. "Yes, sir," he said fervently. Muradin nodded and stuck out a large calloused hand. Arthas shook it. Grinning, he glanced up at his father, who was deep in conversation with Uther. They turned as one to regard him, both pairs of eyes narrowing in speculation, and then inwardly Arthas sighed. He knew that look. So much for playing with Jaina. He'd probably not have time to even see her again before she left. He turned to watch as Callia, her arm around the younger girl's shoulder, swept Jaina from the room. But right before she disappeared through the doorway, Admiral Proudmoore's daughter turned her golden head, caught Arthas's gaze with her own, and smiled. All right, so that was actually a really cool chapter. Tons. She being the author has really just packed in a lot of things in this kind of prelude. So that was good. I really enjoy this book so far. I hope it stays. It has the longevity and the endurance to make it through the whole book. But so far, this is probably my favorite one that we've read so far. All right, so we got this one in the pipe 5x5. On the next episode, we will continue and we'll do some of the other lore from the other book. We won't touch this book again for some time, but that is what it is. All right, thanks everyone for listening so much. I'll see you next time on Lore of Warcraft.